The Me Too movement, what started with a single tweet about sexual harassment 3 years ago, has now grown into probably the most powerful feminist movement of the century. Not only has it changed the way that we might look at acceptable sexual and romantic behavior in a societal sense, but it has also had an influence on many European legal systems as well. But have all of these changes really been for the better? Do we really live in a rape culture that needs to be reformed into a consent one, as the Me Too movement suggests? Or is there a conservative solution to this that once again might be better? Well, let's talk about it. It's an undeniable fact that the Me Too movement has had a huge societal impact. Back in 2017, Hollywood film producer Harvey Weinstein found himself at the heart of the first major Me Too scandal when dozens of women came forward with stories that Weinstein had sexually abused them. Harvey Weinstein is now in jail after being convicted on multiple counts of rape. Rightfully so, clearly. But after these very public accusations were made against him, something emerged that people have come to call the Weinstein effect. Countless of women came forward with similar stories and made allegations against men in powerful positions. Up until today, Time magazine even keeps an online list of powerful men who have been replaced by women after being brought down by the Me Too movement because of alleged sexual misconduct. The list of these people who lost their positions due to the allegations is now at 201 and counting. However, the word allegations is important to emphasize here because a true conviction often fails to happen due to a lack of evidence. This might not be a surprise since many of the allegations being made are about incidents that are said to have taken place sometimes as far back as decades ago. A common explanation for this is that women did not report their aggressor at the time out of fear or hopelessness. Although in some cases this can be a conceivable and plausible explanation, there is in fact a sentiment around the Me Too movement that preaches that any woman who comes forward with an accusation should in fact, by definition, be believed, aka the hashtag #BelieveAllWomen. This call to believe all women is completely at odds with the presumption of innocence, which is one of the most important principles of our democratic rule of law. And obviously, it results in very serious consequences for men who are falsely accused and then scarred for life by trial by media. After all, an accusation alone is often enough to inflict irreversible damage to someone's name. This becomes all the more dangerous when you think about another problematic element of the Me Too movement, which is that it's not always entirely clear when a Me Too situation arises. Not only very obvious criminal offenses, such as rape and sexual assault, are seen as transgressive behavior, but also winking, flirting, or whistling at a woman can easily be denounced as a Me Too moment by many in the movement. It's therefore no surprise that the new credo on Wall Street now reads, "Avoid women at all costs." This basically comes down to the idea that men in powerful positions are better off avoiding women altogether in case they might be accused of inappropriate behavior later in time. So basically, major corporations are now afraid to hire women out of fear of sexual harassment claims. Well played, feminist, well played. Another consequence of the Me Too movement plays into a larger development that's also oftentimes overlooked, which is the plea for something called consent culture, as an antidote for its societal opposite, rape culture. Although these terms were first used in the 1970s, the concept of rape culture is one that goes hand in hand with fourth wave feminism and is defined as a culture in which sexual violence is not only seen as inevitable, but as something that's even often condoned or considered desirable. After hearing this type of description of rape culture, I thought that they were talking about countries where marital rape is not legally recognized, and where under Sharia law, it can be life-threatening for women to come forward and say that they've been raped. But nothing could be more far from the truth. For example, Amnesty International recently published a study called Denmark, Pervasive Rape Culture and Endemic Impunity for Rapists Exposed. Yes, you heard me. Not Yemen, not Afghanistan, and not Somalia, but Denmark has a pervasive rape culture. Indeed, according to fourth wave feminism, our notion of sexual relationships and romance has been influenced and corrupted to its core by rape culture. Actually, the fairy tale Sleeping Beauty is often pointed out as one of the textbook examples of our rape culture, since the Sleeping Beauty wasn't asked for permission when she received the princess kiss of life. I know, it would almost be funny if it weren't so sad. But transforming our society from a rape culture to a consent culture doesn't end with rewriting fairy tales. It actually led to the reform of many European legal systems. Sweden was one of the first European member states to make the change to a consent model with actual explicit reference to the Me Too movement. In the old legal situation, to prove rape, it had to be proven that the sexual act had taken place under coercion or a threat of violence. Now, that requirement is a thing of the past. According to these new Swedish sex laws, the absence of consent is now the core element. A yes can therefore never be assumed under any circumstances. So, for example, it doesn't matter whether you're on a first date with somebody or whether you're part of a 30-year marriage, consent must always and every time be obtained. In practice, this law is expected to be in favor of women rather than men, since the vast majority of rape cases have female victims and a male perpetrator. But especially because this legislation appears to shift the burden of proof from the victim, generally the woman, to the perpetrator, generally a man. In other words, the accused now has the task of convincing a public prosecutor that he in fact did obtain consent prior to the sexual act. This seems to be very much at odds with the idea that anyone is innocent until proven guilty. But Sweden is not the only country that has changed their laws. 11 other countries in Europe already reformed their sex laws from a coercion model to a consent model. An often mentioned argument for this is that a lot of women freeze when they are being sexually assaulted, and therefore they are not able to fight back or to say no. This is absolutely true and definitely not something to be overlooked. But is this particular legal change the way to go? Or does it just create more problems than it solves? In my home country, the Netherlands, our Minister of Justice has also been working on modernizing our sex laws, as he calls it. Our minister, however, wants to take it even one step further than the situation in Sweden. Not only someone who knows that the other person did not consent to the sexual act, but also someone who, given the circumstances, should have known that the sexual interaction was involuntary, should be prosecuted. Okay, so in which given circumstances should someone have known? Well, this is where it gets tricky. Some examples that were given by our minister seem to be very clear. Like, for example, when your partner is crying, indicates pain, or has completely frozen. In these cases, the initiating party has a so-called duty to investigate whether consent is still present. The first question that we should be asking ourselves there is whether it's always crystal clear who initiated the sexual act. Do things in the private sphere, let alone in the romantic sphere, run so unequivocally? Everyone, or I guess almost everyone, will probably answer this question with a no. There is a large risk that this will come down to the man automatically being designated as the initiating party. After all, in most rape cases, it's usually the woman who files the complaint, so she will logically therefore not argue that it was she who initiated the sex. The second question that arises is one of the utmost importance. What type of circumstances invoke this duty to investigate whether someone is still consenting? Our minister mentioned crying as one of the possible pointers, but he also mentioned, and I quote, when someone adopts a reluctant, changing, or slightly hesitant attitude prior or during the sexual acts. That sounds to me like it could give way to situations in which the perpetrator is basically expected to be able to read someone's mind. And that's dangerous. How can we know for sure whether the woman in question indeed had thoughts at that moment that indicated that the sex was involuntary, or whether those thoughts might have been formed the next morning or even years later. There are, although it might not be common, conceivable situations in which a woman regrets her choice, and it is beneficial for her to make the situation seem as though she never really wanted to have sex in the first place. For example, cheating, regret after a night out, or an angry mother or father can easily be straightened out into an "I didn't really want it." Exceptional or not, I give you that, these are all conceivable situations that could put a man who has had sex with a woman in good faith in immense legal and social danger, should he have forgotten to fulfill this duty of investigation, of course, which, in the heat of the moment is all too conceivable. What I think is crucial in all of this is that we should remember that both men and women are actually capable of doing evil things. Therefore, it is especially legally incredibly important that we do not prejudge who is more worthy of protection than the other. Besides, it's important that the burden of proof for serious crimes such as rape isn't too low. After all, these are crimes that carry a long prison sentence and leave a mark on someone's entire life upon conviction. Rightfully so, obviously, but so before someone is actually convicted of such a crime, we must be really certain that someone was in the wrong. After hearing all of this, I can imagine that you might be wondering if these new laws will change much about how hard it is to prove rape. Technically, it's still his word against hers, right? That's right. But there are ways around this that could result into a phenomenon that I call contractualization of sex. This happens through normalization of something called a sexual consent form. I understand you might think this sounds a little surreal, but actually it's not. Watch.
We've spoken about technology and does that offer opportunity? Because we know technology now is more people meet using technology than they do in bars and other locations. And can that be something that assists us try and keep people out of the justice system who are starting relationships and or friendships? Look, I think for mine, a number of the matters that we see involve the victims being impaired and they are often nearly unconscious. Like, I think it would be pretty tough to get someone to sign an app or to make a statement on an app in that case, and for a jury to accept that that was consent given the level of impairment. We're not talking about every situation, but a lot of these matters, a lot of these cases is where the victim's impaired and consent then is implied by the offender, and juries are really struggling with that, and we're seeing hung juries. So, technology doesn't fix everything, but again, it plays such a big role in people meeting at the moment.
So these consent apps or consent forms are seen as a possible solution, which makes sense actually. Coercion, given the nature of it, can obviously not be predetermined. It cannot be, let's say, risk managed. Consent, on the other hand, is something that can easily be recorded in a so-called sex contract. So anyone who thinks that this change in the law will not have an effect is probably not thinking far ahead enough. Both men and women will be more likely to lean towards these consent forms because the law basically encourages them to do so. More and more men will use a consent form to prevent a woman from coming forward after a sexual act, stating that she didn't want it after all years later. And women will want to use consent forms because they are told that this gives them a strong weapon against this imaginary rape culture. However, the opposite is true. In addition to the question of whether such a legal instrument, basically aimed at economic transactions, belongs in the bedroom, there is the question of whether the government should be supervising and regulating our lives between the sheets. While the desire to create a consent culture may have been born out of good intentions, this consent culture can have unforeseen consequences that actually threaten our freedom. Suppose such a contract is signed. How can we be sure that this wasn't done under coercion as well? Or, for example, under the influences of drugs and/or alcohol? And what if a woman signs, for example, at, let's say, 11 p.m., but changes her mind at 11:10, and she has a partner in front of her that is actually in bad faith? Then he rapes her and has a free out-of-jail card. After all, she signed a contract, so no one will believe her, right? See? Solutions to these kinds of problems can only be found in even more rules and even more government interference. And what's the next step? Cameras in the bedroom or a government official next to your bed? These laws will bring more problems than they will solve. And really, I don't think we should even want to open the gateway to this Orwellian nightmare. All of this proves once again that a quick fix that may seem to serve a good purpose often does more harm than good. Instead of these quick fixes, we should live by the saying, it takes 3 generations to make a gentleman. Okay, yes, it may take more effort to raise people into virtuous individuals than to instruct them to sign a piece of paper or to mechanically ask for consent all the time. But a focus on virtues and customs will prove itself to be more durable and successful in the long run. After all, we have found that a virtuous man doesn't need a contract in the first place, and an evil man will do evil anyway, and B, will even find ways to use these laws and measures, like these consent forms, to his advantage. The feminist rape culture narrative that dismisses all men as vicious beings who are predators is statistically and legally simply proven to be wrong. And it leaves no room for the plea for the importance of ethics. After all, if you believe that men are naturally sexual predators, then ethical education can never be enough. It's not surprising then that feminists argue for fundamentally reforming what it means to be a man, and more importantly, for restraining men through these kinds of legal instruments. Indeed, the way in which men should change almost always involves making them more feminine. They should express their emotions more often, feel free to cry, and they should reduce their aggression, according to feminists. By forcing men into a female straitjacket, feminists, I think, will achieve the exact opposite of what they want to achieve. Men do not feel liberated in a feminist society, but instead, they withdraw and become frustrated. This results in the formation of huge online subgroups such as incels, or involuntary celibates. Incels are usually young men who gather on online forums and find each other in the fact that they feel misled by women and the feminized society in which they live, or claim to live. They have spent their entire lives behaving as the feminists demanded of them, so they say, not being too macho, not being too dominant, and not being too loud. Instead of this having them brought successes, most of them are unsuccessful in the business department, but mostly in the romantic and sexual department, hence the name involuntary celibates. These young men are often well into their 20s and have oftentimes not had any sexual experiences at all. They notice that only a small handful of very successful and handsome alpha males can get with women because the majority of women are only interested in those types of men. This leads to enormous frustration amongst these young men, which they often express anonymously on the internet in the form of highly hateful misogynistic language about women. Although this hate is usually limited to the dark circles of the internet, there have in fact already been a number of attacks by these so-called incels who have gone out and murdered random women in the streets out of their alleged frustration. The feminist discourse then responds to these incidents of violence and also actually to the online forums as evidence for their claim that men are inherently toxic and misogynistic. But might it be that these feminists are actually blind to the theory that these kinds of frustrated young men are not an argument to be used in favor of their feminist ideology, but perhaps, to an extent, a very bad consequence of it? Of course, while any form of violence should 100% be condemned and punished, ridiculizing and despising all of these types of boys on the internet is sure to be anything but productive. And what is productive and actually extremely important is that these boys are taught to escape their victimhood mentality and start treating women with respect. But this will not happen without acknowledging their experiences and providing a proper alternative to them. They need role models and they need guidance. People like Jordan Peterson and Harvey Mansfield are and could play a decisive role in this. For example, Peterson argues that it's not girls but boys who suffer most in the modern world, and that they are not allowed to be boyish enough. Contrary to what is often suggested, these men are not anti-feminist, but they preach important classic masculine values, such as chivalry, leadership, and boldness. Peterson doesn't teach men to just go about and fool around, but he teaches them instead to start a family, form long-lasting relationships, and sort themselves out. So the question that ultimately arises here when it comes to these types of topics is, I would say, almost existential in nature. What kind of a society do we want to live in? Do we want our society to consist of virtuous, resilient people who value common sense and common decency, or do we want to create a society in which people enjoy a false sense of security guaranteed by rules and legal instruments? People who care about romance, freedom, the unpredictability of life, and the safety of women have no choice but to choose the first option. So this was our third episode of Let's Talk About It. Thank you so much for watching. I'm really curious to know whether you liked this episode. Please make sure to leave a comment down below and tell me your thoughts. Tell me also if you have any suggestions for a future episode. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss my show now twice a week on both Wednesday and Sunday evening.